We started? Yeah, okay. Last time I was giving you an introduction to the course by going through the syllabus and giving you preparatory material about the nature of philosophy of film and philosophy in film, and also an introduction to the book that you should have read in the selected passages that I indicated on the syllabus for today. That book is Reality Transformed, Film as Meaning and Technique. It's available in the MIT Coop, in the MIT bookstore, the MIT Press bookstore. And if you haven't read it already, you should do so immediately. Since I know you've just come into the class, could you count heads when I say, with my eyes covered, how many have read today's reading? I just want to have an idea of what's going on. What?
Everyone except for me.
Everyone. That's great. Now, one way of proceeding is to start with a discussion of what you've read, but I think it might be a little helpful if I quickly give you my view of it, complicated as that is by the fact that the book was published in 1998 in hardcover. That's more than 5 years ago. I've changed a great deal, and my new book already seems to me like something that belongs to the past. That's the nature of philosophy, dealing with problems in one's life as one's life proceeds. I don't know that I could write that earlier book again now. It's out of my system. It's not perfect. Nothing I've ever done is perfect. But I can say certain things about it that might be of help to you. That would be the first thing I want to do. The next thing I want to do is to return to the movie that you watched last time, The Lady Eve. As I mentioned to you, in the course of, in that year, the last time the only time, in fact, I've used The Lady Eve in this course was a year ago, spring 2003, and having gone through the experience with you, seeing it originally and then seeing it on the commentary, and thinking and listening to what the students got out of it, I started writing a chapter about it, and it ended up being, I think, 54 pages long. As I mentioned last time, I'm not going to be reading it to you, but I may be able to pick up a few of the strands in it that seem especially relevant to what we're doing. What are we doing? We're dealing with film as something that incorporates a way of seeing the world, and therefore is philosophical, even if it doesn't count as philosophy, given the nature of the academic discipline as it exists in any particular place. In the United States, for instance, philosophy is technical in areas, but simply inappropriate to film. The handout I gave to you before, showing the curriculum of this other professor in his course, will show you a different way of doing philosophy of film. The question is how to apply that to actual films. He doesn't indicate how to do that or what he does. I do that to some extent in Reality Transformed, in the chapters that I didn't assign to you for today, because I wanted you to get the theoretical background as you can in 1 week's reading, rather than burdening you with the other chapters in that book. My other course on film, called Philosophy of Film in the fall, is one in which the students read the whole book. That's a different course. If you want to go on to those other chapters, that's fine. The question remains, however, how does one apply philosophical analysis of any sort to a work of art such as a movie? That's what I do in part in the first book, and I do again in a different way in the book that's coming out, Three Philosophical Filmmakers, Hitchcock, Wells, Renoir, and do more explicitly in the next book, which I'm in the middle of writing and haven't finished, the one that deals with myth as a kind of philosophical expression in the form of a story. There are two books I'm writing, actually. One is on the nature of creativity, and that is the basis of the course I'm giving this term called Feeling and Imagination in Art, Science, and Technology. If anyone's interested in that, talk to me later. And the second book, and in that first book, I talk about myth as an example of creativity. The other book is on myth in film and what it is for film to be a form of myth-making. Now that's very pertinent to what the movie you saw last time. That movie, remember, is The Lady Eve, and it starts with animated figures of a snake sort of biting into one or two apples in the representation of a forest. And there's only one myth in the Western world where that makes sense, which is the myth of the Garden of Eden, in which the snake seduces Eve into thinking that she need not live up to God's commandments. God's commandments having been that Adam and Eve, who were just now created, who are innocent, childlike, pure-minded people, though fully grown, that they are commanded that they can eat of all the trees in the forest except for one, which is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And that one they cannot eat. And they're told that if they do eat of it, they will die on that very day. The snake says to Adam and Eve, no, you won't die on that day. I've been here a long time, and I know, and you won't die. It's just a way of God keeping control upon you. And in fact, when Adam and Eve do fall, it's called the fall of Adam, namely they sin, they transgress against God's command and bite into the tree of good and evil, God says to the celestial host, to the angels and cherubims, seraphim, he says, now that they've done this, they will want to be immortal like us, right? So that God then decides that they're not going to be mortal. That's their punishment. They're going to be driven out of the Garden of Eden, but he doesn't put them to death on that day. So what the serpent said was true, that eating the fruit of the tree of good and evil, of knowledge of good and evil, will not bring about your immediate death. And so it's a question that many, many theorists and critics and analysts have pondered. What is the meaning of that tree of the knowledge of good and evil? What is the meaning of the myth? Where does its philosophical importance come in? And there have been a great many interpretations, particularly in visual art. I don't know how much you know about Western art in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. There are many images of Adam and Eve in the garden. Usually it shows them after they've eaten the tree, and they either have fig leaves, because that was demanded by the customs of that period, by what was considered decent and indecent, so a fig leaf for the genitals, but not for the breasts of Eve. It usually shows them with bowed heads, as if they feel guilty. And in fact, in the myth in Genesis, the book of the Bible that describes the Garden of Eden, they don't feel guilty about anything. They have no sense of shame until God catches them having transgressed his law. He says, where have you been, what have you done? And when they finally confess that they've eaten of the forbidden tree, he says, who told you to do this? And they are punished with a sense of guilt. So there's some connection between guilt, shame, and knowledge about good and evil. Now, why it should be that knowledge about good and evil creates a sense of shame, it depends on a certain code of what is ethically right and what is ethically wrong. Moreover, part of their experience after they have been found guilty is that they're ashamed of their body. And one would say, well, what's so shameful about the body? What's so shameful about being nude? I'm sure that's related to what happened at the in television recently with Miss Jackson. One could say, as probably a lot of people in show business would say, well, there's nothing shameful about showing a breast. In many cultures, women show both breasts all the time, and nobody gets very excited about it. What is it about the nature of nudity that brings about a sense of shame? Well, that's what happens in Genesis. So all of these questions are puzzling, but particularly the ones that deal with our sexuality, with our morals, with what is permissible in the world of nature, what it is we can freely have access to. These are all interesting on a philosophical level, including our relationship to other animals, so that in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve live peaceably with all the other animals. There's no talk about their being afraid of being eaten by predators or their killing any animals. They all live in a state of bliss. Once they're exiled from the Garden of Eden, and they feel shame, then they have to toil the soil, which wasn't the case before. They have to work hard by the sweat of their brow, and Eve has children in the reproductive way that we're used to, from which she suffers, because at the time Genesis was written, and for a long time afterwards, childbirth was a very difficult and dangerous practice for women. Many, many women died in childbirth, still do in some cases, but nowhere as much as it was before. So that this too is being accounted for. How it is that work, which we take for granted, and which many cultures consider as a form of bliss, that the ability to work is joyful. My slogan always is, work is joy if you can do it and if the world allows you to. We all feel that when we've accomplished something, particularly students at MIT come in as part of the work ethics. I mean, you wouldn't have succeeded as well in proving your merit to get into it unless you worked very hard and were capable of showing the fruits of that labor. Now, you can't do that unless at some level of your being you enjoy what you're doing. And my own feeling is the more you enjoy what you're doing, the better you'll be at it. But then it's complicated because there are all sorts of ways in which people are encouraged to work hard by making them feel guilty. So that another mythic element in all of this is, what is the relationship between guilt and work, and what kind of enjoyment furthers work? Certainly not all kinds of enjoyment, or else you would never have done your problem sets in high school. You would have gone to the movies all the time. Not for the sake of philosophy of film either, but just to have a good time. So that there is an element of pressure upon you which puts you in a position where you can enjoy your capabilities better than any other way. All of this is worthy of our analysis, and of course many philosophers, ethical philosophers, social philosophers, political philosophers, have talked about that. In the case of the Lady Eve, this is a superficially very light comedy, 1941, what has been called a madcap comedy, a comedy in which people act with tremendous abandon. I mean, how often have you seen girls put out their legs for men to trip over? This is a play of the imagination in which very strange things happen, or I don't have to remind you of the plot, the same girl coming back and pretending to be an English duchess, and even makes fun of herself in a later scene to her so-called uncle. She says, I think I'm going to sound like a cockeyed English duchess for the rest of my life. Her accent is so outrageous, even for English people, that it would have to be a cockeyed duchess who would talk that way. All of this is very uncommon. At the same time, being uncommon, even being artificial, I think is part of what is needed to create a work of art that delves into levels that no scientific enterprise could possibly equal. There is a distinction that I make in a great deal of my writing, in several of my books, between scientific truth and aesthetic truth. If you're interested in that, take my other course on feeling and imagination in art, science, and technology. But they're not the same, as you will admit. Watching a movie, even reading, let's say, John Milton, who has a whole philosophy built into Paradise Lost, is not the same as discovering scientific truths, making scientific theories, experimenting, and somehow reaching generalizations that will be acceptable to other sciences, and they have great importance in the development of technology, right? These are two different kinds of truths. Through the aesthetic truth, there is a way of expressing very delicate, remote, elusive ideas that science has never succeeded in equaling. And I don't think it ever can, because there are different procedures, though they overlap. There can be an aesthetics of science. There's an art of doing science. I always keep thinking of G.H. Hardy, the great mathematician's book called A Mathematician's Apology. And on the last page, he says that pure art, as opposed to pure mathematics as opposed to useful mathematics. If pure mathematics can be justified, it's only as a work of art. And I believe that, I see that. So that mathematics can be seen as a very abstract, very purified kind of art form. In that way, not entirely different from music, particularly abstract music, but also painting, literature, and films. So that there is an overlap between science and art, but what you can do in a movie like this wild madcap comedy is something that science doesn't do. The question is, what can you bring out from your ability to watch and enjoy movies? And that's why I wanted you to watch it first for the fun of it, start getting some sophisticated ideas from the reading I've given you and the preparation I've given you, and today get even more by watching the commentary and then my commentary on the commentary. All right, at this point and at various points in the following weeks, your discussion is very crucial. I don't want the course to turn into two parts, one in which I expound my philosophy and the other in which you watch movies. I want to know what you're getting out of it, and that means you're participating. So let me encourage you, and we'll have more time as we go on. Today, things are a little rushed, but let me encourage you to start interrupting me at any point you want. Right now, for instance. Given the reading you've done, what ideas do you have about it? At times in the past, I've had the class make presentations, somebody in the class make a presentation for the class as a whole by focusing on certain points that that person considers especially useful and relevant. Should we do that in this class? The presentation could only be 5 or 10 minutes, whatever you want. You don't have to write it out. You can handle the situation any way you want. In the student evaluations, most of the students seem satisfied with that, but one student did say the presentation made it unnecessary to do the reading, which isn't true, but anyhow, it would have been much better if we had just had class discussion during those few minutes. Let me ask you to vote. Which would you prefer? And we can reverse the situation at any time. Again, could you take a poll? How many would like to have the one presentation a week format?
Nobody.
Huh? Nobody. Well, you'll see. it's important to know what the vote for the other is. Some would like neither. How many of you would like to have discussions?
5.
Only 5? Well, one other student in the evaluation said, I would have been happier if the course had consisted of the professor lecturing and presenting the material the way it happens in our other courses, instead of his encouraging discussion, and it's not being a straight lecture kind of course. Now, I don't know who that student is, of course, and as I said, the evaluations were very high, but what I would have said to him or her is it's not that kind of course. This is a seminar kind of course, and I want it for this material because this material doesn't really lend itself to lecturing. That's one reason why I hand out that material about the other kind of course given at State University of New York, which has reading lists so that you could get that formal kind of preparation. This course is one in which we will be experiencing together, because this for me is a new experience. Though I've thought about these ideas for many years and written about them, I haven't got a written formula in a series of lectures, and I don't want it, because I want to be looking at you all, and you to be looking back as you do, which is great, and learning. We're communicating, and that's an important principle in film aesthetics that I'll come back later on, which I discuss at length in my 3 Philosophical Filmmakers book. It's that communication which is the basis of the kind of education that you can get in this kind of course. So if at least 5 of you are willing to agree to class participation, let's try that, but I really would like to hear what your input is. You've read all of you have read the material in Reality Transformed. What did it mean to you? What particular ideas? Don't just give me a summary, because everyone's read it, including me, at times of the past. But what are your own ideas? Where does it go wrong? How could it be improved? What did you get out of it? This will come easier as the term goes on, but right now, let me give you the opportunity. All right, then shall I continue beyond that? What I'll do is to give you my version of what's in that book. And it's a little different from what I was saying last time. The fundamental question, as I mentioned last time, was the distinction between formalists and realists. You all got that, right? Any question about that? But the reason I wanted to get into that distinction and to attack people on both sides was not to reject these professional methods of procedure and ideas, but to see how to transcend them. Now, this itself is a method in philosophy that I don't go into in this book, and rarely in others, because methodology is not something I treat very seriously. You do it. You don't have to talk about it. But there is the methodology of a great philosopher that influenced me very much when I was an undergraduate at Harvard. I wrote my undergraduate thesis on him, on his theory of value. His name was John Dewey, and I think I may have mentioned him last time. Maybe that was the other class. John Dewey was called the Dean of American Philosophy. He died in 1953, and nowadays you might never even heard of him, but all of progressive education came out of his educational theories. But he wrote on every branch of philosophy and was fully involved in social, political issues, as well as starting a school for education of his own, and had many followers, and still does, even among people who, for instance, who are in progressive schools who don't know his work very well, though his collected works are still coming out in, I don't know, 80 volumes or whatever. A tremendously productive, great man who lived into his 90s. Dewey's philosophical methodology was briefly this. His feeling was that philosophy is a way of living. Philosophy is a way of dealing with practical problems that are related to be human beings who live the way that we do. But the history of philosophy is a technical discipline, and it's made by people who are very sharp in various areas, and their reason caused them to set up distinctions. And this is the way in which the history of philosophy has in fact progressed. One person will come up with a bright idea, then there'll be others who attack him, and then there'll be others who attack the attackers, and then there'll be scholars who will somehow organize it all in a scholarly, historical way. But it's always a technical profession, and that is the case today. In order to get a professorship, you have to have been trained in that profession. You can't be a wise man. You can't be a devotee of some view. Until recently, Zen or Buddhism, that didn't count. Not too long ago, Catholic philosophy was ostracized. There were certain ways of doing things. In that respect, philosophy is very much like science. You can't do physics unless you do it in a way that is approved by the profession of physics. You know, you can't do it using divining rods or mystical powers that you claim to have. You've got to do it according to the rules that define the activity that is called physics, right? But Dewey's point is that in the case of philosophy, the problems are so immediate, they're so important in terms of how to live, that these artificial distinctions are inevitably damaging, detrimental. So the job of his kind of philosopher is to understand each of the poles of the distinction, to show their inadequacy, and then to show how to transcend that way of making that kind of distinction in terms of practical realities. And from the very start of my career, I've always thought that that's the right approach. And that's what I do in this book, and in fact in all my books. But this one in relation to distinctions made by film theorists in the course of the last 30 or 40 years, the formalists versus the realists. And the only way to get beyond them is to show the inadequacy of each taken separately. Having done that, one can then reconstruct by showing the adequacy, the goodness, the value in some of the ideas they have or their motives, and to harmonize the alternatives, so that the pursuit of harmony, which is a long-standing principle in some Western philosophy, in fact goes back to the father of all philosophy, Plato, who always thought in terms of harmony and harmonization. In fact, the harmony within the universe, which is another question. It's through harmonization that one is able to get out of that artificial fixture that philosophers put themselves into. It's a way of showing the fly how to get out of the fly bottle. You don't do it by using a hammer. You turn the bottle a little, and then all of a sudden the fly gets the idea. Well, the same thing. You turn the distinction to overcome the distinction and end up with a different view. Now, the last chapter, and I gather since the poll was that you all read today's reading, you all got through the last chapter. The last chapter, am I right in that? Do I need to talk about it much? In the last chapter, which in many ways is very superficial, it's short, and it brings the argument together, but the argument hasn't been worked at as carefully as it could have been. It was the best I could do at the time, and I didn't want to make it a tedious treatise. I wanted to make a kind of essay, a long essay. So what I was doing, I approve of, but I know and knew all along it could have been done better. And maybe some of you will come out of this class or other courses in philosophy and CMS with the ability to do it much better. Having got that far, however, what I then felt was the need to write another book in which I would show the implications of the harmonization between formalists and realists that I was sketching in the last chapter of Feeling and Imagination. And so the new book a little of which you'll be reading, because the chapter on the syllabus called Hitchcock is a chapter out of 3 Philosophical Filmmakers. But the reason I wrote that book was in order to deal with 3 great contemporary filmmakers. Now, they've all been dead 25 years. Orson Welles died in 1985, so that's 20 years, and so 20 to 25 years. And Hitchcock maybe a little earlier, not much earlier. And so they've been dead 20 years. But they were all great contemporary filmmakers. And in the book, I try to show how they are both formalists and realists in different ways, different from each other, but also varying with the problems that they were solving from the point of view of their own vision of the world, so that the nature of their philosophical perspective governs the way in which they make a harmonization between form and meaning, between technique and realism, between formalism and realism, between technique and meaning. All right? All right, now the question is, having in this course focused beyond that, because in my way of thinking, I can never do anything until I've lived through it, so that sometimes I reach impasses and dead ends, but since it all means so much to me, or else I couldn't write and wouldn't write, it has an organic importance, and therefore, having got that high or out on a branch, high up the tree or out on a branch, there is an organic process that then works in me, when things go well, for the creation of something out of that. Now, there are lots of idle branches that have no vegetation on them. There are lots of occasions where I'm defeated because my mind and imagination are very limited. But in this case, these books issue out of each other. In that sense, they're a kind of trilogy so far. But if I finish the 3rd one, maybe there'll be a 4th or a 5th, who knows? That's, for me, the meaning of life. And in the 3rd book, what I felt organically was the need to show how it is that myth-making, which is relevant to meaning and philosophical import, can be analyzed on its own and has a very special role in the making of movies. 2 problems there. One, what is it about movies that lends itself to myth-making? Are movies the myths of the 20th and 21st century? Are they equivalent to us, for us, to what the Garden of Eden was to thousands, millions of people for the last 2,000 years? Nobody at the time that the Bible was written thought of putting it in, making a movie out of that, obviously. But since we think in terms of visual images, digital images, electronic effects, since we are fully immersed, and your generation more than any that preceded it, in this way of experiencing the world, it's possible that a product of this way of seeing the world, namely films, might be the best embodiment of the myth-making and the philosophical expression that was done differently in the past by some blind poet, some bard like Homer, or some prophet about whom we know very little in Hebrew culture, who wrote the Old Testament. Those people may still exist, but they're not important the way in which filmmakers are nowadays. What is it about filmmaking? So this is a question about the nature of filmmaking. The other question is, however it comes about, and whatever the aesthetic significance of filmmaking as a kind of myth-making might be, fact remains that some films lend themselves to that as an analysis of what they're doing in the film. And that's what we're starting with The Lady Eve. I stop again for you to make any comments. Good. Could you, actually, this is a good moment for me to learn again your names and to indicate who isn't here. Indicate on my card. Pencil, do I have? I have a pencil. And I'm glad you all, the ones who are here, came on time. Please do make that effort to get here so we can all start right at the right moment. Could you tell me your name?
Ed.
Ed?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll have to find Ed. You made out a card.
Yes. I might have written Edward. Edward?
Edward, okay. Here you are, Edward Song. Great. Has anyone not made out a card? Okay. If you can do this without being distracted, could you make out a card along the lines of this? The bottom line would be anything related in philosophy or CMS. Anyone else needing a new card? Okay, Ed?
Okay, I was just wondering if the realist school of thought was still something very current, because of the way that it was written in the book. It seems to have stemmed from very early in the development of cameras and things like that, because of the way that it seemed very limited to like still photographs and things like that.
Right. Incidentally, I make no attempt to give current movies, though the next one, the one you'll watch next week, is a very current movie, and the one after that, Washington Square, or is that a weekend later, is also, both of them were made within the last 3 to 5 years, so they're current. But that's not my concern. My concern is to deal with the questions, the problems that I can get the most out of philosophically and show you how to get out of philosophically. But as an example of a movie that some of you might know, which doesn't fit what you were just saying, last night I watched a video of the movie The Green Mile. Many of you know it, I'm sure. Does anybody not know it? Oh, good, you all do know it. Well, has mystical overtones, which is a contemporary fashion and based on a novel by Stephen King that realizes that's what people want in their fiction, a certain element of mysticism. But other than that, it's a very realistic movie. As if you were to analyze it formalistically, it's not that exceptional. But where before has a movie ever shown us people in the execution chamber sitting in the electric chair and being put to death? And it's only the realism that makes it work, because if it were inaccurate, if we knew that that's not the way it was, it would be distracting to us. It has to look, yes, that's exactly what it's like, and I never realized it was, or I learned something about what happened in the 1930s, because that's when it takes place, in places like Louisiana that used the electric chair. That's a realistic point. Hitchcock, whom I think is as I was saying last time, a great formalist, he emphasizes the importance of the reality effect, as he calls it. He says, I always strive for that because, frankly, my movies are so bizarre and they're so contrived. In fact, that's what Orson Welles, who didn't like Hitchcock, said. Welles said, Hitchcock's contrivances are nothing but contrivances. In other words, they're tricks in order to frighten you and to build up suspense and to hold on to your attention, as any formalist would have been doing. And the shower scene, remember, I used as an illustration of the formalist idea of Hitchcock's of pure cinema, right? So that for even with his emphasis on formalism, he's always striving to bring out the reality effect the way any realist might. And yet the combination and his genius in both respects put him in a class by himself. So that I don't know that I want to say that realism is not fully treated in what you've been reading, only formalism. Could I go down, get to learn who the rest of you are? You're Peter's son. So there's Edward Song and Peter Son. Okay, if I confuse you, please forgive me. 24900 is Introduction to Linguistics, is it? Or you've not done any philosophy? You don't have to. I was just wondering.
No.
Nothing at all?
No, it's
okay,
taking
good.
problems in philosophy, but I dropped it.
You dropped out of which? Problems.
Yeah.
Why? Can you tell me very briefly why?
I just didn't have enough time for the class.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Because it's a very different kind of philosophy course from this one. My hope is that after this one you'll want to take more, but maybe not. Lux Chen is you, right? Lux Chen. Incidentally, while I'm doing this, please make any comments that you want to of any sort. Catherine Chang? Chang, right? Not Chang, Chang, right? You're Lauren Coney. Miguel Rivera. So I've learned some of your names already. George Martin? No, see? You're George Martin.
I go by Carrie, though. I go by
Carrie.
Carrie.
That's right, Carrie Martin. What's the name of the Martin who worked with the Beatles?
That's George Martin. Yeah.
That's George.
I don't know his middle name, though.
That's George. He is a very, very talented man. He's really the fifth Beatle, because a lot of the music theory came out of him, and yet he had the wisdom and the capacity to bring it out of their performances in their own way, so that it isn't that they were puppets of his. I really admire him as a coach and producer of those four talented Beatles very, very much. Anyhow, remember that you're Carrie. You're not that Martin. I realize. David Levinson. Okay. Anybody I've not called? And this is everybody's paperwork. Anybody else? What I want to do, since we don't have much time, is to this is a glance at my chapter. I assure you I will not even begin to read it, but looking at the text might give me some ideas. And one question is, who in the movie is the serpent? Remember, the serpent occurs in the animation. Who is the serpent? We have Eve, right? We have Adam, and in the biblical account, Adam is sort of simple-minded. He's pure, and therefore, when his wife says, "Well, it's all right. I take a bite. Do you want to take a bite?" He naturally, in a good-humored, dumb way, agrees. And when he is chastised, he says to God, as if this is his excuse, a typical weak male. He says, "Well, my wife told me to do it." That's not good enough. But who is the serpent? Now, my governing idea is that Muggsy is the serpent. It starts with the serpent and with Muggsy in the first scene. It ends with Muggsy coming out of the bedroom, the stateroom, and though we don't know how he got in there or what he was doing there, and looking at the camera and saying, remember the words, positively the same dame, right? Well, the serpent is the voice of experience. My mentor at Harvard, whose death I lament, he was over 80 when he died, but for many years he was a great figure in my life. He always used to say to me, "Irving, you've got to learn the wisdom of the serpent," meaning you've got to learn how to live in the real world. Well, the serpent does know how to live in the real world. What he says to Eve is not a falsehood. He isn't simply seducing or deceiving her, they wouldn't die, and they didn't die. And he intimates that he's eaten of it, and probably that's true. Muggsy is that. Muggsy speaks with the voice of experience, and he's right. He says it is the same woman all along, and he's right. He considers her little group a pack of Sharpies, of card cheats, and he is right. But he doesn't know what love is. So there are things that he doesn't know the way the serpent doesn't know. And that's because they don't belong to ordinary practical experience. Love somehow transcends that, and the movie is about what you do with the attractiveness of love when it has to function in the practical world in which everybody is cheating or being serpentine. I remember Levinson, I've forgotten your first name. David.
I looked at the Eve's father, I guess was her father, or the card person she worked with. As like I see him almost as a serpent.
As what?
Figure, as a serpent, as the serpent figure too. Maybe he like entices Eve to. Was his name Eve? Maybe right.
Well, her name is Jean at the
Jean,
beginning.
that's right. Like he almost entices her to take Adam's money. Maybe he could be seen as a serpent figure in that way. That like he was the mastermind behind the whole card tricking, and he trained Eve or Jeannie.
No, one feels, this is something I emphasize in my chapter, that after Jean Eve, let's call her, and Charles get married, they're probably going to dismiss Muggsy as no longer being needed. He was there to protect Charles from the treachery of the world, and does a fairly good job apparently, and saved his life on one occasion. But now that he's married, he doesn't need a nursemaid anymore, and that Muggsy and Jean Eve's father would go into business together, being card sharpies and somehow cheats surviving in the world. I think you're right. There is that element in Muggsy, because he's not interested in love, and he is interested in the material things of the world, just like Eve's father. But what's crucial is that he is the serpent in the plot that we see more than the father is. The father isn't really a serpent, he's a crook. He knows how to live in the world, but that's not his role in guiding the development of the story. Incidentally, are the students being filmed? It isn't just me, is it?
So far, it's just you.
I mean, David here, was he picked up?
Not on that one, no.
Okay, I don't know what your procedure is.
I can do it if everyone agrees to
It might not be a bad idea, in general.
Everyone's okay with it.
Okay. Anybody want to say anything else? All right, so the question is about Muggsy being the representation of the serpent. Then the question is, what is the nature of the role that the female has? Because there's not only the myth of Eve, who causes a lot of trouble when she bites into an apple. And remember, the movie begins with her dropping an apple that she's already bitten into from her level of the deck onto Charles as he's getting into the ship. But also, what's the fact about Eve being a woman? Now, there are two views in the history of Western mythology about the nature of women. One view is that women are evil. They're the cause of evil. They lure men into having sex with them for reproductive purposes, or just because they make a living from that as prostitutes. So that this part of myth is all created by the man's self-pitying point of view. I mean, there wouldn't be prostitutes if there weren't societies in which women were relegated to that role. There wouldn't be a need for the woman to lure the man to do the reproductive jobs that in principle he wants as much as she, because he has genes that he wants to move into the gene pool and propagate the future with. So why is she especially evil? That's one view of woman, and that is elaborated in different ways. In some traditions, the idea of Eve is not enough, and so there's the notion of Lilith, Lilith, who is sort of the earth spirit and is female, and who comes into existence before Adam and Eve. That's an addendum to the story in Genesis. In Genesis, Eve is the mother of humanities, and she is pure and beautiful and ideal until she is misled by the serpent, and the serpent is a male symbol. Now, some people analyzing the movie Lady Eve say, oh, it's obvious that the serpent is a male principle. Why? Because he slithers in the way that an anatomical part of the male does, and that's why Eve, for instance, in the movie, is frightened of serpents. Women are afraid of that part of the male's anatomy. Well, I myself don't give much credence to that, because I've never felt that I could wholeheartedly agree to Freudian interpretations or Jungian interpretations. In the commentary you'll be hearing, they come into it in a way that seems to me very far-fetched. But the point about Eve is that she's divided into the character into two parts. As Jean, she falls in love in a pure and wholesome way. Having been rejected by the male, remember, after he sees the photographs that incriminate her as a card sharpie, she becomes vicious. She becomes destructive. So there's a good Eve, which is Jean, and there's a bad Eve who is out to destroy the innocent but dumb, somewhat dumb male. I need him, she says, shortly after that pivotal moment when she changes from Jean into Eve. On the ship, not on the ship, but after at the horse races, she says, I need him the way the axe needs the turkey. Now, to speak of somebody as a turkey is to say it's a ridiculous creature, and the axe is an instrument of destruction, because we use the axe to kill the turkey and then to devour him. Now, this is a different kind of character. And one of the things I learned from the commentary, because there are these brilliant aspects, which, as I told you, only a woman would pick up, and I didn't, and that is the clothing of Barbara Stanwyck changes as she moves from Jean into Eve. And she looks very cold and haughty and really magnificent, but of a stylish sort once she's become Eve and is wearing a fur coat and a fur hat on the ship, and thereafter. So that even in the choice of clothes, there were the two sides of a single woman. Positively the same name, but that doesn't preclude the fact that women are of two different sorts. They're the innocent sort that Eve is in the Garden of Eden before she falls, and there's the evil sort that Lilith is as the darker side of the earth spirit, which men have to protect themselves against. And the question then is, how can the two be harmonized? I mean, we can't have everybody separated in that way. That's what's called the myth of the whore virgin, that women are either virgins, which means they have no sex, and then they're pure, right? They're virginal. But if they do have sex, then they're whores, even if they're not prostitutes. That is part of a certain sick male mentality, thinking of women as falling into one or the other class. We all want to overcome that distinction, particularly educated people in the 21st century. We've lived through enough to know there's something wrong in that kind of distinction. The question is, how can the two be harmonized? And the movie shows that. Jean starts out one way, but pure and good as she is, because she has a good heart, she also has a history. She has a shady past as part of this gang of crooks. But she's converted by means of her love, falling in love with Charles, and says, I want to be everything that he wants me to be. And and she fights her father against his desire to cheat the rich young man. All of that puts her on the side of the angels, and then when she turns into Eve, she's the very opposite. And seeing the shift is itself humorous. It's funny to see extreme, conventional, formalist versions of human character pitted against each other like that. At the same time, the movie ends up with the two being harmonized. As Muggsy says, possibly the same name, but now it means something different. Now it means that there is a way in which women can have a bad past and yet be beautiful, wonderful creatures in the present. Jean sort of is the intellect in this movie. She's the smartest one of the whole bunch, much smarter than Charles. He's been up the Amazon for a year, and he's a student, probably just out of Yale, and he knows about snakes, but he doesn't know any much about women. She is smarter than him, and she outsmarts her father. In fact, at one point when she defies her father, she says to him, "It's not free that I'm your daughter." In other words, you don't get that for nothing. What you get is the fact that I've learned from you everything that I need to surpass you. I forget the exact quote. You'll come across it today if you don't remember it from last week. It's not for nothing that I'm your daughter. In other words, I'm smarter than you are, and as a matter of fact, she is. She devises a way of finally solving this romantic problem, marrying the right man, rich, good-hearted, in love with her, whom she's in love with. This is a marriage made in heaven, like the original Adam and Eve, which God created. And so God will have his hand in this reconstruction after the bitterness of having lived outside of Eden, of finding a kind of little paradise which marital love promises to some people. She does that by carrying out the message that she had enunciated when before Charles has seen the photograph. She says, the trouble with you, Charles, you'll remember this or it'll come back to you, is that you haven't had much experience with women. Some girls, as she calls them, I apologize, but that's her word. Some girls are nowhere as bad as you think, and nowhere as good as you think. That they're not just, you can't distinguish among them between those who are good and those who are bad. Women, like everybody else, is a composite, and in that composite, the goodness counterbalances the badness, and the badness restrains the goodness. So they're nowhere as bad and nowhere as good as an inexperienced person like Charles might think, right? All right, she shows that. At the end, she's not as bad as she has been acting in the second half. It appears very beautifully when they're on the train. You remember, Charles gets off and falls on his backside in the mud, and she's watching all of this humiliation and painful situation he's got himself into in his pajamas out in the cold on the mud. because he stopped the train. She's watching this from her out of the window of her stateroom, and then slowly reaches for the curtain and pulls it down. And she doesn't sort of chortle. She doesn't pull it down. Ha! That's the end of that. The axe has found its turkey. She does it in a kind of regretful way, sad. Possibly a compassionate attitude toward him, though this isn't developed very far, but it's enough. We get the feeling that maybe she has second thoughts about what she has done. She doesn't savor her victory over him. She sadly pulls down the curtain and knows she's on her own now. And then immediately afterwards, she refuses to take money from him. She refuses to trump her victory by getting alimony as the basis of their divorce. She asks only that he come to talk to her, knowing perhaps we could work it out. And then when he refuses, she goes and looks for him again, because she's so smart, she knows how to do it. So that she's not as bad as one might think, either because she was a card shark or part of the group, with her father, after all, so somehow she's an innocent, because the father is more responsible, or when she's out to get vengeance by pretending to be the Lady Eve. She now extends herself on his behalf, and she shows us a kind of reconciliation between the two. The very last moments, Charles, who was so angry at her, first because the photograph indicated she had deceived him, later when he thinks that she's really an unprincipled woman who's had all these boyfriends, that she had made up, but he doesn't know it. He's furious with her then, hateful toward her. He overcomes that when on the ship he trips again, and there she is, and throws himself into her arms, and she throws herself into his arms. It's a reconciliation which shows that girls are not as bad or as good as one thought. So this deals with the woman problem in typical myths, and also gives a solution about how love can be a happy resolution, how marriage between them, having been through what they've been through, could very well succeed. In Shakespeare's play, Much Ado About Nothing, did I mention that last time? I'm not sure. You get the same idea of love being the result of aggression between male and female, because this is somehow in our genes. We're programmed to do that, to fight each other off, because males and females are so different. There's a great deal of aggressiveness and hostility until they work out some kind of performance, like in the case of herring gulls, where the male does a kind of dance that pacifies the females and assures her of his goodwill, and then she admits him into her property, and they mate and raise a family together. There's a way of overcoming the aggressiveness, but it takes a certain pattern, a certain aesthetic development, the mating dance, a certain performance that the male and the female both have to go through. And a great deal of the screwball comedies of the 1930s, culminating with this great screwball comedy, there have been others too earlier, but 1941, that's about the end of that genre, in which they go through this heartrending relationship, and then finally learn how to perform in a way that takes them into the possibility of a happy ending. So the happiness of the ending is very crucial to it, and how it is brought about. Now here I have neglected about 52 pages of my 53-page chapter, but we've got to stop in order to play the commentary for you. If anybody wants to say anything while we're walking to the screening room, could you do it now? But this, I think, is time to stop filming. Okay? Any problems?